The Spanish flu was one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history, estimated to affect 500 million people and killing around 50 million people worldwide. As this unknown virus entered the population, people started making misconceptions, blaming other nations, soldiers, and even immigrants due to wartime tensions. The unknown aspect of this led to public health measures being implemented like mask mandates, quarantines, and the closing of public gathering areas. Now, you may think this sounds pretty familiar. If we jump forward around 100 years, we are taken to the COVID 19 pandemic. But we aren't there yet. Judgments made during the first parts of the Spanish flu were very minimal due to wartime censorship. For example, in the United States, the government used censorship of the First Amendment to try and limit the news about the Spanish flu, while the Spanish government was willing to cover the pandemic in full detail. This led to widespread misconception that the flu had started in Spain, when really, Spain believed that it started in France. Acts like the Espionage and Sedition Acts were used to keep information about the flu out of the public eye to protect with wartime efforts. If it were not for the Spanish government, many people would not have known about the pandemic and it could have affected a lot more people, showing how in other countries this censorship and denial caused more fear within the population and may have been a factor in the large number of cases. While most governments put restrictions on the population, compliance with these restrictions varied, with inconsistent enforcement due to public resistance and lack of space. These restrictions also created bias against the working class and immigrants as they were thought to have poor hygiene practices while living in crowded urban areas. Many people started to not trust the government and judge them in a negative way due to this censorship, causing issues with compliance of public health measures. Due to the Spanish flu being an unknown illness, many believed it was caused by a bacterial infection type of illness. This led to bacterial treatments being done that gave no protection against the actual virus itself. The lack of effective treatments led to people relying on folk remedies, patent medicines, and unproven therapies to try and combat this illness. With the end of World War I happening at the same time as the virus, many involved governments began censoring news about the flu to maintain morale. Despite this causing the virus to spread rapidly among soldiers in trenches and camps, judgments on this sickness were still hindered by the war effort. Many people blamed immigrants and marginalized groups for the disease's spread and based their judgments on fear and ignorance with no evidence. This caused tension between the public. Women were also judged as natural caregivers and were given the job of caring for the sick. This just ended up leading to them getting sick as well, and a disproportionate amount of women caring for children rather than any men. With regards to religion, many people believed the pandemic was divine punishment for the war and their societal sins. Religious leaders wanted people to pray and repent, with some opposing public health measures. Many employers had to face the decision of leaving their business open or closing their business. A good number of businesses kept their operations running while prioritizing economic survival. This decision was also faced by politicians being either praised or ridiculed for not taking quick enough action. During the Spanish flu, many people developed a distrust for the government due to their poor communication and inconsistent efforts to contain the virus. Different social classes as well as cultural biases caused people to judge others and accuse them of being the reason for the spread of the sickness. A positive that came out of the Spanish flu was the realization of the need for a more coordinated and better public health system. Now we fast forward to the more modern version of the Spanish flu, the COVID 19 pandemic. This pandemic was something that I, as well as many other people, had to live through and experience. Judgments during this pandemic heavily relied on social media and the modern quick spread of information. Unlike the COVID pandemic, where we had a much better understanding of virology and vaccines, the Spanish flu was an unknown virus where we were very underdeveloped in our understanding of medicine and health, making the COVID pandemic more easily researched and understood. There was also much more coordination between different countries trying to work together to combat the COVID pandemic. While COVID was going on, there was also a massive uptick with the BLM movement. This added a lot of controversy within the COVID pandemic and started talk about the effects of the pandemic on Black communities. The tension within the United States started rising, and more opinions about life during COVID began being voiced. This caused a push for the government to try and find a cure for the virus, while also having to fix systemic problems within our country, putting a toll on the government and raising tensions even more. Other tensions were rising as people started referring to COVID as things like the China virus and blaming Asian people for the start of the pandemic. This caused a global divide and raised racial and social tensions even more. Just like the Spanish flu, mask mandates, quarantines, and other restrictions were placed, with many people not complying to these measures. Judgments on masks were polarized, and social distancing efforts were criticized by some for disruption of everyday life. Many countries and some states called for lockdowns, with supporters saying it's for the greater good and opposition saying it messes up mental health, schooling, and the country's economies. Many world leaders were judged and trusted based on how well they handled the pandemic. Many countries like New Zealand gave consistent updates and messaging, leading to more trust with their people, while other leaders were criticized for downplaying the importance of the pandemic. Rather than just leaders, most nations were judged based on vaccine sharing and their compliance with the rest of the world's policies, with leaders being criticized for prioritizing political agendas over the importance of public health. Many people who did not get vaccinated were judged as irresponsible and uncaring by people who did get the vaccine, while educators and schools were judged on their ability to adapt to the new online learning style. Some people argued that online school and work would help in the long run, while most saw the negative effects on productivity and children's mental health. Most people in schools felt that it did not matter and were blamed for the spread of the virus through noncompliance with guidelines. Many governments were judged negatively for comparing the importance of public health with economic impacts. Things like stimulus checks, unemployment checks, and non eviction policies were heavily debated on their long term economic consequences, which is why essential versus non essential jobs were debated, with low paid individuals in healthcare, grocery, and delivery services taking a lot of risks while still prioritizing work. The COVID pandemic and the Spanish flu were both very impactful events on our society that had a lot of judgment involved in decisions and social outlook. There were many similarities between the two events, and the use of social media within the spread of COVID made information more widely available. Both also sparked conversation about the importance of individual freedoms versus a collective social responsibility, with protests and resentment in following these restrictions and guidelines. And finally, both of these events stress the importance of preparation for a future pandemic and the need for global cooperation with guidelines and vaccine distribution.